I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is Scald. You're about to hear a chapter of the only story that matters. Every week, I write a brand new episode of this ongoing sword and sorcery serial, and then I record it in one single, flawless take. No one else does that. The story is an ongoing one, but you should absolutely feel free to jump in here. Or you can go back and you can listen to previous episodes, or even check out the prose volumes on Amazon. They're only $2.99 each. Whichever way you go, it's a good choice. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is Scald, part 35. The giant flexed his muscles, felt them fill with blood and vitality, felt them contract and expand so quickly that he thought his bones would crack, breaking under the strain. The giant looked down at his thick limbs, corded with rippling muscle and the veins necessary to fuel it. He looked down, but despite the strength he felt coursing through his body, despite that tangible proof of his power, he saw that slowly, surely, inevitably, his limbs were becoming intangible. They were still there, still visible, but they wouldn't be for long. He could see the green skin shimmer and fade, could see the green flesh beneath begin to disperse. He even thought he could see his bones, the ones that threatened to shatter in the face of his overwhelming power, thought that he could see them disintegrate before his very eyes. It was time. He could wait no longer. Every second spent putting it off only saw him draw closer to the end, to complete dissolution, to being disregarded, cast aside, forgotten. If he would stay in that world, in that realm, in that plane, if he would continue to exist at all, he needed to act. He needed to exert himself and express himself. He needed to show that he mattered, that he still mattered, that he could reach out and affect the world around him. He needed to struggle, to fight, and to win. So he stood as best he was able, because though that cave, the one where he spent the majority of each day, though it was cavernous, it still wasn't large enough to contain his prodigious bulk, the mountainous piles of muscle stacked upon his cyclopean frame. He hunched, lowering his head to avoid the ancient stalactites that lined the ceiling, and he began shuffling to the opening, to the cave's mouth, to the outside world beyond. He emerged from the cave, and he blinked. It was nighttime and dark, but the full moon hung heavy in the sky. Its light shone down brightly enough that it was reflected off his deep green skin, shone brightly enough that he needed a moment to adjust as the moonlight pierced his pale blue eyes. And as he did, he heard the cheers begin to swell around him, jubilant chants that rose in an unstoppable crescendo, filling the air and speeding off across the landscape as they chanted his name. Kargan, Kargan, Kargan. He straightened himself, arching his back, feeling the muscles that lined his spine stretch and relax at his command. He looked out at his subjects, with their bulbous noses, their glassy eyes cloaked in ignorance, and the thick, puffy green skin that covered their bodies. He looked out at the trolls. He allowed a gargantuan smile to spread across his humongous face, a massive flash of pearly white teeth that looked more suited to crushing rocks than chewing food. His subjects chanted louder and louder, overcome with joy and excitement, thrilled to see the giant, to see the destroyer, to see Kargan on the move. Kargan smiled at his subjects benevolently. They were stupid, nescient, truly ignorant of not only the world around them, but of themselves as well. They were angry, hateful, common, crude, and base. But they weren't as bad as they could be, weren't as bad as their brethren in the unaffiliated territories. Trolls, the ones that waited calmly for Kargan, then erupted with glee at the sight of him, the ones that performed menial tasks for their leader, the ones that even began to use simple tools while going about their errands. They weren't the smartest of the trolls, because what would that even mean? But they were the least ignorant. He'd chosen them, had brought them to his cave, the largest he could find in that broken landscape. And at first, it had been enough. He looked down upon the trolls, both literally and figuratively, because how could they compare to one such as him? Foolish beasts, without the presence of mind required to set a path for oneself and follow it. Not like him. Not like Kargan, the destroyer, who had summoned the trolls to his side, who had inspired loyalty in these moronic creatures, sacks of sagging flesh and muscle, impressive for their size perhaps, but not compared to Kargan. How could those simple trolls compare to a giant, to a destroyer? They couldn't. And soon enough, that became the problem. He had been buttressed by their presence, buoyed by their stupidity, by being stronger, smarter, quicker, more powerful. He had surpassed them. He had become better. But better than what? Better than a swarm of mindless monsters? Better than a mob of weak, aimless flesh? He had attempted to scramble over their foolish, brittle forms, to step upon their broken bodies, to climb up upon a pedestal, a perch that would give him legitimacy, focus, and meaning. He had meant to compare himself to the trolls, but had soon found there was no comparison. Being better than them meant nothing. Meant less than nothing, as by comparing himself to them, he had debased himself, lessened himself, cast himself low. He had realized this unavoidable truth, and to his dismay, he had begun to disappear. Now, he begun to disappear once again. His very presence, his very existence began to evaporate before his eyes. And there was only one solution, only one thing to be done, only one thing for it. He had to emerge from his cave. He had to matter. He had to mean something. He had to struggle. He had to fight. And he had to win. His subjects began to cheer wildly in anticipation of their leader's words. Bring me a challenge. As his subjects erupted, eyes clenched shut, mouths stretched open to an unnatural degree, Kargan shot a worried glance down at his arms. His forearms were worse than he realized, were worse than he had been able to tell in the dim light of the cave. They were nearly transparent. He was nearly able to see the rocky tundra through them. He knew He could still move them, could still clench his fingers into the mighty fist that had felled so many challenges in the past, but he had no idea whether he could actually connect with them, or if his fists had grown so ethereal as to be useless in a fight. But that was a question that could only be answered in one way. So he looked up expectantly as his subjects parted, making way for his challenger. The trolls in attendance were terrified, scrambling to make room, to clear a path, to avoid the foot-long claws of that giant reptilian beast. Though they maintained their composure better, the trolls responsible for the monster were no less terrified as they clutched the chains that ran out from the lizard's neck. It had taken months for them to perfect the technique, but they did it just as Kargan had taught them. 8 chains attached to the heavy metal collar around the beast's neck, 2 trolls at the end of every chain, pulling the heavy metal taut to prevent the monster from clamping its massive jaws down on anything but the dead air of that barren wasteland. Kargans watched as they struggled to maintain control of the beast, as trolls ran to take cover from its snapping jaws. Thought about how many trolls had died as they learned to capture and subdue a beast such as this. Thought of how many had seen their lifeblood spilled upon the earth as they attempted to clamp the collar on this particular monster. Kargan shook his head, and he sighed with disappointment. A Trogado. Another Trogado. The foolish beasts, with no idea where to find anything else, with no clue how to hunt anything else down, they had once again delved into the earth, had traveled down treacherous shafts and crumbling tunnels, had scrabbled in the dark, throwing body after body after body at this nearly blind monster. For fear of disappointing their master, they had brought him this disappointing offering. Another Trogado. He'd faced them before, had faced and defeated Trogados time and time again. After that initial frenzy, back when wild beasts could still be easily found upon the tundra, the Trogado had been all that survived. He had hoped, as he always hoped, for something new, something different, but as always, he ended up with this. Another Trogado. He glanced down at his forearms once again, sighing as he looked through them, clearly making out the shattered granite that littered the ground. His current condition, perhaps a Trogado, another Trogado, was actually for the best. So he raised his head, lowered his eyebrows, and he cried out, "Release the challenge and begin!" Trogado charged, just as they always did. They were meant to kill, to eat, to reproduce, and to die, preferably in that order. Like all beasts, they were flexible in that regard. Trogado had no tactics, wouldn't have had them even if it could see clearly in the too bright moonlight. It simply charged, a rampaging storm of claws, of teeth, and of death. Kargan braced himself. He raised his hands, the ones that seemed to melt away in the moonlight, in the face of this weak challenge, this fight that should have been beneath him. He dropped a shoulder. He moved one foot back. He prepared to seize the beast, to grab it by its neck, low enough to constrict its throat, but high enough that its teeth couldn't reach him, to snatch it up the second before impact. But when the Troglodyte rushed forward, when it came into range, when it drew close enough for Kargan to reach out with his massive hands, the giant's massive hands went through the challenger. There was no time for shock, for strategy, or even for fear, as the Troglodyte, unhindered, smashed into Kargan, ramming its massive, bony skull into his chest. The beast had left the ground, had struck the giant's solar plexus with the full mass of its charging body. It forced the air from his lungs and made Kargan feel as if his ribcage would collapse, would pierce his heart, and would send him falling into that inky black void. Nothingness. But Kargan's fall was soon interrupted as his back smashed into the rocky earth of that forsaken realm. Kargan struggled to raise his knees, a tactic that would serve a dual purpose. First, with his disappearing arms no use, he would need his legs to separate himself from the monster. And second, he hoped that repositioning his prone body would allow air back into his spasming, empty lungs. The lizard was massive, but not so large that it couldn't be budged, moved, lifted by Kargan's colossal legs, those stately columns that had themselves begun evaporating, though not as quickly as his arms. He hoisted the Troglodyte up, and none too soon, as a quick head movement was all that saved him from having his throat disappear. Not in slow, silent evaporation, but in a quick, violent gnashing of teeth. The moment was safe as anyone could be while pinned down by a ravenous Troglodyte. But that moment wouldn't last long. And when it was over, the Troglodyte would shift and lunge, snap, snap, snapping, until all that was left of Kargan was a pile of bloody flesh. And it wouldn't matter if he disappeared or not, because he'd already be gone, sent plummeting into the inky black void of nothingness. There was no other choice. Kargan had to act, and he had to act quickly. With his feet planted on the ground, with his knees keeping the Troglodyte at a still too close distance, with the Troglodyte plunging its thick, scaly neck directly at him, Kargan raised his neck violently. He threw his head forward, and he gave the beast a taste of its own medicine, smashing his skull into the creature's soft, vulnerable snout. There was no other choice. He had moved his head so quick, so hard, so violently that his attack went past the creature's nose, colliding into the long, sharp, curved teeth that lined its jaw. And though the Troglodyte drew blood, carving a long gash in Kargan's forehead, the beast suffered the worst of the damage as its teeth cracked, broke, and shattered with the impact. The Troglodyte reared back, making a terrible noise, one so awful that the trolls covered their twisted, protruding ears. But it was a noise to which Kargan was accustomed. Part wail of agony, part battle cry, part unspeakable threat. Troglodyte had been shocked, been wounded, been insulted, and now it would have its revenge. Or die trying. But Kargan had already decided it would be the latter. Hoping for the best, refusing to acknowledge the worst, he sprang into action. He was still pinned down, with that massive lizard writhing and struggling on top of him, but the giant was far from helpless. He separated his knees, allowing the massive lizard to fall toward him, wrapping his legs around its thrashing body in a lightning-quick motion. More importantly, as the beast fell, Kargan shot his hazy, disintegrating right palm upward, shot it toward the Trogodo's neck, to the spot low enough to cut off the air, but high enough to avoid those still deadly teeth. He shot his ethereal hand upward, and it connected. If the lizard's cold, unseeing eyes could register any emotion but hunger, they would have been shocked, floored by the speed at which one spectral hand clutched its throat and the other wrapped around its neck. The trolls had seen this trick before. Their memories were nothing to speak of, but their bodies, the very spirit that animated them, responded to their leader's brutal speed, his violent maneuvering. It spoke to them loudly and in no uncertain terms, and in response, their cheers rose in volume, filling that world with their bloodthirsty cries, shouting so loud that as Kargan cinched his legs together as he held one hand in place and twisted the other sharply. He couldn't even hear the crack of the monster's neck. With the trolls still roaring, with their frenzy growing more and more violent, with the subjects beginning to turn on one another in their fevered celebrations, Kargan forced himself to his feet, shoving the Trogodo's limp, motionless form to the ground. The giant forced himself up upon legs as real as the rocks they stood upon, and he tossed aside his vanquished opponent with thick, powerful arms that had reclaimed their corporal nature. Kargan, now fully present in body as well as mind, turned from his subjects. He held his head high. He flexed his muscles. He felt their strength. He looked down at his hands, heavy, meaningful, and real. And he marched back to his cave. Xylan returned to his senses with his snout buried in the stomach of the howling troll. He had blacked out. No, not black, but red. He had lost himself. His mind had gone elsewhere, further than even where it was kept at bay by his bestial urges. The sanguine hunger had taken over, but now it had allowed him to return, had allowed what remained of Xylan, the man, to come limping back to the horrible, gruesome meal he had made for himself. With his nose, his mouth, most of his head still buried in the troll's entrails, sniffing, chewing, tearing, and devouring, he did his best to look around the room. What he saw sickened him. No, but it would have sickened him. The godless monk was now present enough to know that in his prior state, his state before the change, he would have been disgusted by this scene, mortified by his hungers, and repulsed by how he had sated them. But now, there was no room in Xylan's furry head for revulsion. There was only space for hunger, agonizing, insatiable hunger. Unable to stop his jaws from their gruesome pursuit, he did his best to scan the room with those big, black, empty eyes, the ones that sat deep inside his spotted head. First, he went to the noise, to the source of that howl, so pitiable, so pitiful, so wretched and filled with dismay that Xylan felt the laughter building up within him. It would have burst forth, boiling over and spilling out of his jaws in a gush of sardonic cackles. It would have. If his jaws hadn't been so busy tearing out the still pumping organs of that tormented, howling troll. Xylan, still eating, still feasting, scanned what else he could see of the room, the one he had left as a stone chamber and returned to as a charnel house. Amongst the gore, amongst the viscera, the flecks of flesh and bone and tissue, he saw the cauldron, the iron pot, the simple tool that the troll had endeavored to and ultimately did wield, lying nearby. Troll's trembling hand, his bloated fingers, they made to creep across the floor toward it. But Xylan knew there wasn't strength enough left to reach it, much less to lift it. The troll's strength had left his body, and now it dribbled down Xylan's chin. The bestial monk choked down laughter once again. Over his slurping, his gnawing, over the cracking of bone and the bursting of organs he could not name, Xylan heard a noise. He heard a threat. He heard a rival. He heard the noise of one or possibly of many. He heard the noise of an opponent, one who would take his meal, would take what was his, would take sustenance and life from his very jaws. So with a feral quickness, he leapt, driven upward by his lean, explosive hind legs. All four paws shot off the ground, then returned just as quickly, with Xylan facing in the opposite direction, but with his jaws still buried in the groaning troll's stomach. When the bestial monk landed, he saw what had disturbed him, what had drawn his attention, what was important enough to distract him from his meal. Trolls. Filling the doorway and the staircase beyond, the trolls stood there, looks of ignorance blanketing their bulbous features. They had made to move into the room. They meant to move on Xylan, meant to take from them. But he had caught them. Xylan made a difficult choice, one that he needed to make. He abandoned his meal, albeit briefly, and he lifted his head, keeping both of his big, black, empty eyes on that group of silent, slack-jawed trolls. He lifted his head slowly, with blood, viscera, and offal dripping down from his maw, splattering sickeningly from the stones below. He made no motion toward them because he knew that true strength is shown through inaction. He made no effort to approach them, no effort to attack, to defend, to maneuver for position. He made no effort to even frighten them. No, he didn't sneer. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He did one thing and one thing only. He laughed. The laugh he had choked down twice that he remembered, and who knows how many times while he was gone, while he was lost in the red, in the sanguine hunger. He opened the floodgates. He broke the dam. He released a torrent of laughter that started in his gut, then rose up and burst from his lips, carrying bits of flesh, of blood, and of bile upon its frothing surface. He cackled at what he'd been. He snickered at what he'd become. He guffawed at the world around him, and he became lost in hysterics, overcome by the atavistic, grim joke of existence. But the joke didn't sit well with the trolls. Truthfully, that joke sits well with no one, not even those who laugh hardest at it, especially not those who laugh hardest at it. The trolls found no humor in the cackling, blood-covered beast that stood in the innards of their fallen brother, so with fear in their eyes, with bile rising up in their throats, they backed away. And they disappeared into the darkness. Xylan watched as they left, laughing all the while, cackling until he saw the last of the troll's shadows vanish into the stairwell, and as he caught his breath from his riotous outburst, he saw something that he had missed. The sorceress. She lay nearby, beaten and bruised, worse for wear, but still miraculously breathing. And even more miraculously, as Xylan watched, as the last strains of his chaotic laughter reverberated off the stone walls of the tower, the sorceress began to stir. As consciousness returned to her, she sat up suddenly. Too suddenly, as between the movement, the blood loss, and the beating she had sustained, she was overcome with dizziness. Her hand instinctively shot to her head, but when she touched the growing knot on her scalp, she recoiled, winced, and clenched her eyes shut even more tightly. Then, as the bestial monk watched her in curious silence, she coughed and began to open her eyes. She had been prepared for all manner of horrors, for death at the hands of the trolls, for the inky black void of nothingness, and worst of all, she was prepared to find herself transformed, her skin green, her eyes glassy, and her face cloaked in ignorance. But what she found when she opened her eyes was far more horrifying than anything she could have imagined. Confronted with that macabre sight, greeted by a panting scavenger beast, a monster that sat covered in gore, sitting contentedly in the remains of a savaged, quickly fading troll, she felt her very soul quaver, shake, and fear. She tried to stand and failed, but succeeded in scrambling away across the stone floor, taking what refuge she could behind a massive, overturned table. I take it you're not hungry. Xylan chuckled, but the speech, the laughter that emanated unnaturally from the beast's mouth, only served to further terrify the sorceress. A beast that speaks like a man. She shook her head, her lips turning up into a sneer. Foul perversion, unnatural abomination, what manner of monster are you? Xylan lowered his head, and he emitted a caustic laugh. I'm just as you say, a perversion, an abomination, and more besides. He looked up, catching the sorceress's gaze with his big, black, empty eyes. But you, they call me Xylan. The sorceress lowered her guard slightly, but made no move to come out from behind her table. Xylan, my name is Caleria. She squinted her eyes, trying and failing to get a read on the bloody mess that sat staring back at her. Are you here to rescue me? It was different this time. Lighter, Less grim, less mean and hateful, different than it had been since its change. Xylan's body convulsed. He clenched his eyes shut, and he fell upon the ground, laughing so hard that he could not speak. If you're digging Scald, please help spread the word in real life and online, especially with those iTunes reviews. If you leave a good one, I'll even read it on the show. You don't even have to get super verbose or detailed with it either. Chris from Delaware says simply, "Wow, this is good. The man can tell a mean story." Right now, there are count them, 2 Scald ebooks available for you on Amazon.com, collecting 16 episodes each for the low, low price of $2.99. If you're looking to catch up on what you've missed, or just want an additional way to enjoy the show, this is the perfect way to do it. Selling ebooks is one of the ways I try to monetize Scald, but if you really want to support the only story that matters, you have to go to patreon.com/Scald. There, you can sign up to contribute a small monthly donation that will help me keep the show going. A few bucks for 4 episodes of Scald each and every month seems like a no-brainer to me. I would love to hear from you on social media. Find me on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, and Instagram. Username Aubrey Sitterson. Or hit up AubreySitterson.com for links to everything, including Scald, the Scald ebooks, my comics writing, my wrestling talk show Straight Shoot, bio, contact information, and more. My recommendation to you this week, it's the newest from Satan's Satyrs, Don't Deliver Us. I first heard of these guys when I saw them opening for Electric Wizard, and I was immediately all in. They do a bluesy, catchy, skate metal take on the classic, doomy Black Sabbath sound, and it's great for hanging out around the house, cruising around town, or pretty much everything else. They're more groovy than hard or heavy. You should definitely check them out. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.